He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that with a little uneasy laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver, he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. That is a passage from my personal favorite ghost story in all of English literature. And you probably guessed it, it is our Halloween episode. Guys, I can't believe it. We've been doing this show for over a year now, which means that the holiday episodes are coming back around. These are some of my favorite things to do on this show for Halloween, for Thanksgiving, for Christmas, and later on for Easter. We're going to do a bunch of special episodes that kind of take a little bit of a branch off maybe from our typical format, our typical way of doing things, and just look at some of the classic entertainments and ideas behind our holidays. I think holidays are sort of quietly one of the things that are under assault at the moment. Sometimes not so quietly, right? We just had Columbus Day, which is being renamed to Indigenous Peoples Day before our eyes. If you want to know my take on that, which is that I refuse to engage with it, and categorically I say no, you can go to the American Mind and read my piece, Hate Columbus, Hate America. But there's something deeper and more serious behind this, right? What are people doing when they're trying to unsettle our national holidays? Well, one major reason why they do that is because it's considered to be intolerant or unfair that certain things in our culture get celebrated. Sometimes we say that those things themselves are bad, like with Columbus Day. But then sometimes, with Christmas, we just say, well, this is not, this is a country with freedom of religion. Why do we elevate this Christian holiday, right? And the key to all of this, right, is even if there are interesting discussions to be had around the history of a given holiday, and I think there are sometimes. I mean, one of the things about Columbus Day, for example, is that the West, Europe, has always been uncomfortable with what happened in the Indies, right? It's not as if this is some new discovery, right? That when people engage in acts of conquest, as everybody was doing at the time, like when that happens, there are excesses, people are flawed, people are broken, right? All of this is old news. What's new is this ignorant idea that you can somehow get a better history if you just wipe out the one we currently have, right? That somehow now we're so virtuous, the most virtuous people in the world, as I think Matt Walsh said on the Backstage Live Daily Wire, right, are now living, and they are going to craft a new history with no complications, with no discomforts, and no sin in the past. What that means, of course, right, since we only get the one history of America, the one country which, although, yes, we have freedom of religion, this country was founded by Christians, right, and Christianity was a major driving force behind the ideology of this nation. And it was founded by Europeans, even though, of course, we are open to all races, right, and we don't distinguish according to color in this country. It was founded by Europeans, right? We think that if we could just erase that history, we'll get a better one, right? But that's the only history we have. And so when people try to unsettle what you might call it's almost our secular liturgical calendar, right? It's just the way that the rhythm of our year plays out. It's not that there aren't religious aspects of that, but they're kind of big dates that we all are supposed to be able to come around and enjoy and take time off. Every civilization has these. We've talked about one of the major ones in Athens, the city Dionysia, which was this yearly festival at which the great art of Athens was aired and shown to everybody, right? These are incredibly important civic markers. They're not just days off. They're milestones. They're markers in the sand that show what we care about, what we think about, what's on our mind. And so it's actually really important to take a little bit of time and think about not just the fun stuff that we do on these holidays, but why we do that fun stuff, where it comes from, what it says about us, what kind of literary connotations it has. So that's why we're going to read The Monkey's Paw today and talk a little bit about Halloween and why so many scary stories that now appear on Netflix and on TV are crap. It's my favorite part of the show because it's the part where I get to talk to you about freeze-dried duck nibs. What I mean by that is it's time to talk about Public Goods, who are our sponsors. They sell incredible basics. I use them all throughout my house. They look great. They're always designed in fantastic packaging. You get stuff like, dish soap and hand soap, but also chocolate covered almonds, which I love to snack on, all sorts of foods, ramen and stuff like that. And toilet paper, cat food, freeze dried duck nibs. You can get everything at Public Goods, really. And it's all made in this really healthy way. I'm a health nut, so I love that this stuff is really not injected with a bunch of weird chemicals and slop like that. This is just pure good stuff. It looks great in your kitchen, in your bathroom, in your pantry, wherever. And they are offering an incredible deal for our listeners. This really is amazing. You can get $15 of free stuff. No minimum purchase, just $15 off when you go to publicgoods.com/heretics, just like in the title, HERETICS, or use the code heretics at checkout. So that's PUBLICGOODS.com/heretics. And you get $15 of actual free stuff that you will not pay dollars for. $15 off at publicgoods.com/heretics. So if you go back to the previous last year's Halloween episode, you'll hear me talk a lot about the kind of Celtic origins of Halloween and the way that this Celtic festival, this sort of Celtic marker of the turning of the year, the changing of the seasons into fall, that kind of got absorbed up into the Christian liturgical calendar as the British Isles were Christianized. And so that's effectively what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a Christianization of an intuition that every culture has, which is that there are more things on heaven and earth than are dreamed of in your philosophy. And everybody gets the heebie-jeebies because everybody has a sense that there is something more to us than just flesh and blood. If we didn't have that intuitive sense, if we didn't feel as if there was this spooky other thing about us besides our biology and our desires and our appetites, right? If we didn't feel that way, the concept of a ghost would make no sense at all. The concept of a vampire would make no sense, because what are all of those things? They are human souls, right? Human souls brought to life, human souls continuing after death, people taking human souls away, right? Everything depends on this idea that there is something personal about you, which is not just what you do when you wake up in the morning, the food you eat, the place you were born, but is eternal, which lives after your death, and which has moral character and is in a certain kind of moral danger, which can be physicalized in horrible, horrifying ways, right? This idea that if your soul is corrupted, or if your soul is kind of dragged down by the dark forces of evil, well, then you're in serious trouble, worse trouble than if you were being, physically assaulted in some ways. You can't tell a ghost story without that idea. It's almost the premise of that idea. And I'm going to get in a minute to why that means our modern ghost stories are all falling flat. They're all either just gore fests, which in my opinion is completely boring, because that's a purely physical horror, right? It's funny, like after you've encountered physical horror, that's kind of the end of it. There are many different ways for people to physically suffer. They're very ugly. We don't like to see them. But that's, fine. For me, ultimately, once you've seen that and you get acclimatized to it, you're kind of like, well, that's the end of that scare. But there's no end to spiritual horror and to creepy inclinations that something out of the corner of your eye is watching you. Somebody's coming back from the dead. And the reason for that, right, is that there is this entire vastness of the world, which, Jesus says, do not fear him who can kill only the body, but fear him who can destroy the body and cast the soul into Gehenna, right? There is something more to us, which means that there is a whole universe of barely seen horrors and delights outside of our field of vision. And ghost stories all exist to express in the culture this deep primal sense that we have that that's true. And the reason why the church doesn't just, completely eradicate this tradition, but actually eventually kind of carries it up into this idea of All Souls Day, right? Which gets secularized in some cultures, including ours, as this, maintenance of Halloween. The reason why all of that happens is because we recognize a certain intuition of truth in these ghost stories, just like we recognize intuitions of truth in, the Stoic system of philosophy, right? I've talked before about this kind of natural law idea that everywhere in the world, even though not all cultures are Judeo-Christian, right? Everywhere in the world, there are intuitions and intimations of the truth that is made known in Christ. That's the idea here. That's why these stories continue to compel and inspire and freak us out. And I'm going to read one which is a kind of a proof of this concept, because of the subtlety of it, because of the way which is to me the creepiest thing, that we never actually see the monster. It's always kind of just outside our field of vision, and the monster is very much rooted in the realities of the human world. It's not like this is some sort of alien from outer space. This is something closely, deeply connected to our human tendencies, our human fallibilities. And it's really short. So since this is our special and since it's public domain, I'm going to try to read the entire thing because it's so short. I might have to skip over some pieces depending on time. And I will stop and comment as we go. But I'm going to try and read the entire story, The Monkey's Paw, as a Halloween entertainment. And then I'll talk about what it says and what it expresses. This is a kind of a one-hit wonder, this story. It's by a fella named W. Jacobs. He lived at the turn of the 20th century. And I talked, when we discussed The Great Good Place, I talked about what was happening to literature at this time, that it was sort of transitioning out of realism, which was the second half, roughly, of the 19th century, kind of starts in places like in France with people like Stendhal, and, Russia with like Pushkin, Flaubert, and all these guys who are writing sort of true to life literature that eschews extravagant Deus ex machina or like big coincidences and literary gestures, and wants to focus literature on the realities of daily life. This is where we get this idea of realism, which is a style unto itself, right? It's not just the natural way we all do art. It's something that occurs to people during this time. And then as people like Freud start to become popular, and these theories about the inner life gain so much traction, right? What's Freud all about? It's about what's going on under the hood, right? The gears that are turning in your head, the things that you're thinking about, and also these new ideas that I've kind of taken to task on this show about subjectivism, right? That they're, so much of our experience, part of which is true, right? So much of our experience is mediated through what we see and feel, that we start to turn inward and try to recreate in art the inner experience, the inner reality. And that's roughly, that's the shift of modernism, which is happening around this time. So Henry James, I mentioned, right, kind of moves in this modernist direction. Things are subjective. They kind of melt into one another. You're never quite sure. Stream of consciousness is another big part of this literary technique. But Jacobs, W. Jacobs, who's writing right around the same time as James, Jacobs is like a basic bro. He's kind of, he's a lower class guy born to a poor family on the docks in Kent, in Southwark. This is south east of England. Can be a very beautiful place, but he was born also, to a poor family. Worked his way up in life. He got a post at the post office. He was a clerk in the post office, and then started to make his name writing short stories, many of them humorous, kind of like the P.G. Wodehouse is kind of the master of this genre that he's working in, the sort of funny comedy of manners, and stories of the macabre. So we rarely read almost anything that Jacobs ever wrote, except for The Monkey's Paw, which comes out in 1902 in one of his collections called Lady of the Barge. And this is just a perfectly executed ghost story. And so we still read this, even though Jacobs himself is kind of getting swept under by the tide. You'll see that his writing is very sort of realist, very observation of daily life. And even though it's sometimes funny, sometimes horrifying, sometimes supernatural, his focus is just on painting you a real picture of what's going on. There is, by the way, this is going to be kind of a funny episode because I'm going to cite a source that I almost never cite, and that's Slate magazine. Obviously, I could not disagree more with what the people at Slate believe politically. They're stone leftists, but they do have a thriving culture section, and they printed the whole Monkey's Paw with illustrations on their website. So I am reading from that website, and if you don't mind giving Slate a couple clicks, head over there and check this out. Here's chapter 1, the beginning of The Monkey's Paw. Without, the night was cold and wet, but in the small parlor of Laburnum Villa, The blinds were drawn, and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were at chess. The former, who possessed ideas about the game involving radical changes, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary perils that it even provoked comment from the white-haired old lady, knitting placidly by the fire. So just that paragraph, so dense, right? And perfectly sets up this little domestic scene of the son has these radical ideas about chess. He's beating the older man, and the white-haired old lady, his mother, is knitting by the fire. "Hark at the wind," said Mr. White. This is the White family. Here's the father, Mr. White, who, having seen a fatal mistake after it was too late, was amiably desirous of preventing his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the latter grimly, surveying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check. I should hardly think that he'd come tonight," said his father, with his hand poised over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "That's the worst of living so far out," bawled Mr. White with sudden and unlooked-for violence. "Of all the beastly, slushy, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Pathway's a bog, and the road's a torrent. I don't know what people are thinking about. I suppose because only 2 houses in the road are let, they think it doesn't matter." "Never mind, dear," said his wife soothingly. "Perhaps you'll win the next one." Mr. White looked up sharply, just in time to intercept a knowing glance between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty grin in his thin, gray beard. So again, this kind of masterfully realist technique where with a few short strokes, we have seen exactly what these relationships are like in this family. And because Jacobs is kind of a basic bro, they're not particularly, original or strange, but they're very charming, right? We like this family. We want to be with them in this little hut. And we've set the scene, right? They're living far out. They're sort of marshy and it's hard to reach them. They're far away from civilization. And we'll see that this is going to be like a central feature of the story, as is the he who's coming, right? Who's coming. But if you were studying how to build suspense, this would be a wonderful passage to study, right? Because it's so compact, so small, and yet we get all this information about who these folks are, their relationships with one another, and that something is coming from the world out there. This is a remote place, but someone is coming. "There he is," said Herbert White, as the gate banged to loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose with hospitable haste, and opening the door, was heard condoling with the new arrival. The new arrival also condoled with himself, so that Mrs. White said "tut tut" and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, burly man, beady of eye and rubicund of visage. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him. Okay, so it's a soldier home from service. Obviously, this is the first introduction of what's going to become the great conflict. Hey, is your face all crusty and gross? Because you should really fix that. Guys tend to think that skincare is like only for women. This is dead wrong. Whenever I want to clean up my face, look good, I use Disco, which is facial care products designed specifically for men. In particular, they have this roller stick that you put underneath your eyes. I get bagged under my eyes all the time. I think I don't sleep very much and just, typical life stuff. They also make stuff for razor burn, for acne, for all kinds of things that guys tend to deal with. And you can't go around looking like a schlub, you won't get the girls, you won't get the good job, whatever. You got to fix your face. So go to Disco and pick up some of their excellent cleaning products. You can rest assured knowing that they are Liz Wheeler approved because they are vegan. I love everything that they have sent me, everything I've used from them. If you want to check out Disco and try their incredible skincare products for yourself, there is a special offer for the Young Heretics audience, and that's at letsdisco.com. Enter Heretics at checkout, and you will get 30% off. That is astronomical. 30%. Got to get it before it goes away. Letsdisco.com. Enter Heretics at checkout so that your face won't look gross and weird, because ain't nobody like that. All right, back to the show. So here's Sergeant Major Morris. He's made his way into this little cabin, this hut. Hut is probably a too extravagant a way of describing it, right? But like a shack, maybe you might say. Obviously, Jacob's drawing here on his humble beginnings, his humble past, to paint this realistic picture of what life is like in the remote wilds of England. And the Sergeant Major, we're soon going to discover, is coming from England's colonial outposts. He's coming from India, where he has been serving in the military. So the Sergeant Major shook hands and, taking the proffered seat by the fire, watched contentedly while his host got out whiskey in tumblers and stood a small copper kettle on the fire. At the third glass, his eyes got brighter, and he began to talk. The little family circle regarding with eager interest this visitor from distant parts as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and doughty deeds, of wars and plagues and strange peoples. 21 years of it, said Mr. White, nodding at his wife and son. When he went away, he was a slip of a youth in the warehouse. Now look at him. He didn't look to have taken much harm, said Mrs. White politely. I'd like to go to India myself, said the old man. Just look round a bit, you know. Better where you are, said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, took it again. I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and jugglers, said the old man. What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris? Nothing, said the soldier hastily. Leastways, nothing worth hearing. This is, of course, a great source of adventure and inspiration for British writers during the colonial period, right? That there is this entire set of foreign lands where people believe different things, do different things. And to some extent, they do exoticize it, as any culture exoticizes another meeting. I mean, people are so different in their ways of behaving and acting that you would naturally have this sort of curiosity about, well, what's going on out there? I mean, it's sort of like, this is in some ways the inheritance of Herodotus, right? Herodotus, the Greek historian, the father of history, as he's often called, who looks out on places like Ethiopia and indeed India and Egypt especially, right? And just wants to know, right, how do people act out there? And so this is part of the mechanism whereby authors during this time create a sense that there is still adventure in the world. There's unknown stuff to be discovered. Civilization is not all that there is, which is ideal for a ghost story. So, okay, the sergeant major is obviously trying hard not to talk about the monkey's paw, which makes us want to know more. And so does Mrs. White. Monkey's paw, said Mrs. White curiously. Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps, said the sergeant major offhandedly. His three listeners leaned forward eagerly. The visitor absent-mindedly put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. His host filled it for him. To look at, said the sergeant major, fumbling in his pocket. It's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy. He took something out of his pocket and proffered it. Mrs. White drew back with a grimace, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. And what is there special about it? Inquired Mr. White, as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. It had a spell put on it by an old fakir, said the sergeant major, a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and that those who interfered with it did so to their sorrow. He put a spell on it, so that 3 separate men could each have 3 wishes from it. His manner was so impressive that his hearers were conscious that their light laughter jarred somewhat. Well, why don't you have 3, sir? Said Herbert White cleverly. The soldier regarded him in the way that middle age is wont to regard presumptuous youth. I have, he said quietly, and his blotchy face whitened. And did you really have the 3 wishes granted? Asked Mrs. White. I did, said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. And has anybody else wished? Persisted the old lady. The first man had his 3 wishes, yes, was the reply. I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw. This concept that this is a device for showing how fate rules men's lives, right, is tapping in, again, to very primal instincts in the literary world. It's the same mechanism that drives a play like Oedipus, the King, right? And it's the same series of reflections that people like Polybius give us about Tyche, which is the word for fate or fortune, and whether or not there's any such thing as free will or personal agency within it. But this is a supernatural version of that, which essentially says the cosmos has you locked in to a destiny, to a reality, and you can't countervail it, even if you do so by magic, right? There's kind of a Faustian element to this too, that, you know, when you undertake to muscle the universe out of its natural course, this is something that we can't help doing. The curiosity in this story, right, is really driving it forward, and yet this is always to our undoing, to our detriment. So what is the fate? I mean, the kind of governing question behind this story, if there is one, right, is what is the thing that we can't avoid? Like, what's the fate that we're locked locked into that we can't escape. His tones were so grave that a hush fell on the group. This is the sergeant major. If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris, said the old man at last. What do you keep it for? The soldier shook his head. Fancy, I suppose, he said slowly. I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused enough mischief already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's a fairy tale, some of them, and those who do think anything of it want to try first and pay me afterward. If you could have another 3 wishes, said the old man, eyeing him keenly, would you have them? I don't know, said the other. I don't know. He took the paw and, dangling it between his forefinger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. White, with a slight cry, stooped down and snatched it off. Better let it burn, said the soldier solemnly. If you don't want it, Morris, said the other, give it to me. I won't, said his friend doggedly. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't blame me for what happens. Pitch it on the fire again like a sensible man. The other shook his head and examined his new possession closely. How do you do it? He inquired. Hold up your right hand and wish aloud, said the sergeant major. But I warn you of the consequences. Sounds like the Arabian Nights, said Mrs. White, as she rose and began to set the supper. Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me? This is this sort of comic interjection is what you might call, intratextuality or metatextuality, right? Awareness of the text, within the text, of its own references, right? So if you're being like a fancy critic about this, right, that's what's going on. Jacobs is basically letting us in on the fact that he knows what kind of story he's telling. And it also breaks this tension that's been building of like what happens when you wish on the monkey's paw. Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and then all 3 burst into laughter as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. If you must wish, he said gruffly, wish for something sensible. That is, don't wish for your wife to have 4 arms. Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket and, placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of supper, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the 3 sat listening in an enthralled fashion to a second installment of the soldier's adventures in India. If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us, said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guests, just in time for him to catch the last rain, we shan't make much out of it. Did you give him anything for it, father? Inquired Mrs. White, regarding her husband closely. A trifle, said he, coloring slightly. He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me to throw it away again. Likely, said Herbert, with pretended horror, we're going to be rich and famous and happy. Wish to be an emperor, father, to begin with. Then you can't be henpecked. He darted around the table, pursued by the maligned Mrs. White, armed with an antimacassar. So Herbert is obviously this sort of ruddy, rambunctious lad. We all like him. He seems like an adult son, right? Living with his parents to help them. I mean, this was obviously much more common at the time to live with his parents. I suspect that these folks have some sort of agricultural profession. It's never made quite clear, but obviously he's there as a dutiful son, helping with whatever the family business is. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it dubiously. I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact, he said slowly. It seems to me I've got all I want. If you only cleared the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you? Said Herbert with his hand on his shoulder. Well, wish for £200 then. That'll just do it. So he's wishing to pay off his mortgage, right? His father, smiling shamefacedly at his own credulity, held up the talisman as his son, with a solemn face, somewhat marred by a wink at his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few impressive chords. I wish for £200, said the old man distinctly. A fine crash from the piano greeted the words, interrupted by a shuddering cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him. It moved, he cried, with a glance of disgust at the object as it lay on the floor. As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake. Well, I don't see the money, said his son as he picked it up and placed it on the table, and I bet I never shall. It must have been your fancy, father, said his wife, regarding him anxiously. He shook his head. Never mind, though, there's no harm done. But it gave me a shock all the same. They sat down by the fire again while the 2 men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man started nervously at the sound of the door banging upstairs. A silence, unusual and depressing, settled upon all 3, which lasted until the old couple rose to retire for the night. I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed, said Herbert as he bade them good night, and something horrible squatting up on top of the wardrobe, watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten gains. He sat alone in the darkness, gazing at the dying fire, and seeing faces in it. The last face was so horrible and so simian that he gazed at it in amazement. It got so vivid that with a little uneasy laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing a little water to throw over it. His hand grasped the monkey's paw, and with a little shiver, he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. That is the end of part one. And this is, you can see how masterfully Jacobs has brought this kind of dark cloud of tension and anxiety over the story, right? The paw moves, right? Nobody can deny at this point that there's something more uncanny about this than they want there to be. And the way that comes in and troubles what is really their domestic bliss. I mean, that's that little line, right? I don't know what to wish for. I have everything I want. Is this kind of expression, again, a kind of folkloric expression that we hear in story and story and story again and again and again, right? That his contentment is the thing that he should be listening to. And instead, he has this kind of curiosity. We're tormented, all of us, by our curiosity, right? To reach out and just know beyond what's here. And this is not necessarily an inherently bad thing, right? It drives us to do all these great things, to accomplish great achievements. But there's inherently also something dangerous about it. And when we mess with the wrong things, that is, when we mess with the foundational principles of the universe, we have this intuition that things are going to go terribly wrong. Okay, on to part two. So for the sake of time, I am going to skip just a few of the intervening sections here, but this is part two. There are three parts to the story. They made the wish last night. The sun rises. Everything looks bright and beautiful and really, as you do after a spooky night around the fire telling stories. They've kind of forgotten what the mood was like, and they just think that probably it's it was the shadows and the shivers playing tricks on them. Everything's fine. Herbert, the son, goes off to work, and the parents remain at home. They're sort of talking and bantering, and then the wife was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside who, peering in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the 200 pounds, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed and wore a silk hat of glossy newness. 3 times he paused at the gate and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then, with sudden resolution, flung it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White at the same moment placed her hands behind her, and hurriedly unfastening the strings of her apron, put that useful article of apparel beneath the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed ill at ease, into the room. He gazed at her furtively and listened in a preoccupied fashion as the old lady apologized for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, a garment which he usually reserved for the garden. She then waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to broach his business, but he was at first strangely silent. "I was asked to call," he said at last, and stooped and picked a piece of cotton from his trousers. "I come from Maw and Meggins," which is a kind of obvious name of some sort of firm or corporation that employs the son, right? The old lady started. "Is anything the matter?" she asked breathlessly. "Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?" So this is Herbert's employer here. Her husband interposed. There, mother," he said hastily. "Sit down and don't jump to conclusions. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir." And he eyed the other wistfully. "I'm sorry," began the visitor. "Is he hurt?" demanded the mother wildly. The visitor bowed in assent. "Badly hurt," he said quietly, "but he is not in any pain." "Oh, thank God," said the old woman, clasping her hands. "Thank God for that. She broke off suddenly as the sinister meaning of the assurance dawned upon her, and she saw the awful confirmation of her fears in the other's averted face. She caught her breath, and turning to her slower-witted husband, laid her trembling old hand upon his. There was a long silence. "He was caught in the machinery," said the visitor at length in a low voice. "Caught in the machinery," repeated Mr. White in a dazed fashion. "Yes." He sat staring blankly out at the window, and taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it as he had been wont to do in their old courting days, nearly 40 years before. "He was the only one left to us," he said, turning gently to the visitor. "It is hard." So this is where we get this kind of intervention of real horror, real tragedy, right? Because, of course, even still now today, the rate of miscarriage and failed pregnancies is so much higher than we let on or that we know about. But at this point in time, in the turn of the 20th century, I mean, there were just so many lost children, and almost practically every couple, right, had some story of the child that never was, the child that died young. Shakespeare famously had one, Hamnet, his son, and so we've now kind of intersected this supernatural story, right, with the reality, right, of the broken world and the sorrows we experience, and the yearning, of course, that leads us to. that something could be done about it, right? So previously they were just trying to fix their financial troubles, their sort of minor annoyances. Now things get more serious. The other coughed, that is the fellow from Ma and Megan's coughed, and rising, walked slowly to the window. The firm wished me to convey their sincere sympathy with you in your great loss, he said, without looking around. I beg that you will understand I am only their servant and merely obeying orders. There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring and her breath inaudible. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend the sergeant might have carried into his first action. I want to say that Ma and Megan's disclaim all responsibility, continued the other. They admit no liability at all, but in consideration of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum as compensation. Mr. White dropped his wife's hand and, rising to his feet, gazed with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words, "How much?" £200 was the answer. Unconscious of his wife's shriek, the old man smiled faintly, put out his hands like a sightless man, and dropped, a senseless heap, to the floor. So, this is, of course, the turn. It's the second act, right? It's the moment when we realize that we're really in for it. The third act is going to play this out, but I just want to pause here and say that I don't think you can fully grasp the world that this story is presenting to you unless you grasp part of what the Industrial Revolution did to families like the Whites, right? These families that have been, I think they're probably involved in some kind of agricultural business. I mentioned that Jacob's own family worked on the docks, right? So families like this where there was a family trade and the integrity of the household, right, was in some sense built around this idea and everybody kind of worked on this thing together, and your father and your father's father all worked on the same thing. Now there's this kind of uncertain, nameless place where Herbert is still living, with his parents, but he goes off to this unknown place out far away, right? And they're living in this kind of remote rural village. But where is Herbert going, right? And we know some things about it, right? There's machinery there, and the machinery is so deadly and dangerous that you can get caught in it. And the people who manage the machinery send you these faceless bureaucrats at your moment of deepest bereavement, right? The tenderness of these parents who have already lost so many children, now having to be told they've lost their last one, right? And who is this guy? He's this nervous functionary sent to read from a script, right? Dear Sir or Madam. And this is in some ways the birth of a world that we now know, right? Which is the birth of the disconnection of our work and our labor from our daily lives and from the meaning and the family life that we build in our daily lives, right? This is, my imagination has always been that the son gets caught in a thresher, right? Which is one of the big drivers of this, of the agricultural part of the Industrial Revolution, right? 1837, the thresher is patented. This is this device for separating things like peas and other, legumes from their pods. Eventually, this will be combined with other things to become the combine harvester, right? It's this machine, highly dangerous, involves many blades moving about, right, in rapid fashion. And I suspect that he either falls into the thresher or, something happens. There's sort of this unknown mechanical menace of the way the world is shaping up, right? That we're mechanizing things. And we are now still, in some sense, reckoning with that force in our lives, this technological force that takes our work out of the home and gives us this incredible material wealth, but also creates these sometimes even unseen, unacknowledged costs, right? People are still wrestling with that at this point in history, at the turn of the 20th century. And we are basically being invited to consider the spiritual implications of it by this story, right? That there's something kind of supernatural, unnatural, and nasty about the way that the son has been lured away to what looks like work, like normal work, to his doom, right? By this mysterious force from outside the world. If you want to know more about this, my colleague James Poulos writes a ton of stuff about it. He's got a book coming out, Human Forever, where he talks about digital technology and the way that it basically unhumanizes us, right? Or threatens to, at least, right? When we gain things from the scientific revolution, from the technological revolution, from all of these grand advancements in our way of doing things, we also introduce instability in the sort of natural ways that humans go about living their lives. And in some sense, this monkey's paw, right, which comes in and again asserts the basic primal facts of the cosmos, like fate, right, is a horrific way to be reminded, right, that we are not going to just abstract ourselves out into this perfect technological, in our world, we would say perfect, like digital Zoom cloud, right? We are always going to be rooted in certain basic truths about the universe. We have to find some way to be content in the limitations of our humanity, even as we celebrate technological process and all of those things. So all of this is unspoken in the story, but just the mere fact, right, that he's caught in this machine, which is doing something to work, that is affecting the way that these people live. The reason that they live in this sort of remote place rather than in a village, right, or a farming community, is probably because Ma and Megan's, the corporation, has basically aggregated to itself all of this technological power, which, for all of its benefits and all of its goodness, also comes with a cost. And for the whites, it comes with a terrible cost. Okay, let's hear the chilling conclusion. This is our first holiday episode, which means that soon everybody is going to be scrambling to buy gifts. I know that I, like basically every male of the species, wake up on like November 15th and I'm like, holy crap, what am I going to get X for his birthday? What am I going to do for Christmas? Blah, blah, blah. The answer to all of this is Paint Your Life. They are this incredible company that takes photos of stuff you love, and memories, whatever you want to pick, right, and turns them into handmade paintings. You will work with a professional artist until it's done and perfect. You can get this portrait in as little as 2 weeks. So if you have the dude problem, right, the classic dude problem of waking up and being like, oh crap, I have to get stuff for Christmas, this is your solution. Paint Your Life. Amazing paintings you will cherish forever. I got one. It's in the set. Chad Cat, my kitten, is back behind me. They did a phenomenal job. And you can get one of anything. You know, you could get a place you've been that you love, a person who's no longer with you, anything at all. If you text Heretics, Heretics, to 64,000, you will get a special offer of 20% off your painting. That's Heretics. Text it to 64,000. Terms apply. You can find them at paintyourlife.com/terms. And if you don't love the final painting, your money is refunded. So there's no risk. Try it out. Heretics, text it to 64,000. All right, back to the show. Part 3 really is where it gives you the true heebie-jeebies. In the huge new cemetery, some 2 miles distant, the old people buried their dead and came back to a house steeped in shadow and silence. So see, this is what I was just talking about, right? It was a new cemetery, right? It's huge, which means it's probably not connected to a church, right? Which is where you would typically have your graveyard. Some 2 miles distant, right? So it's far away, they're remote, they're isolated. Civilizational life is kind of aggregating into these urban centers. And people like this old couple are being alienated from themselves. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it and remained in a state of expectation as though of something else to happen. Something else which was to lighten this load, too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and expectation gave place to resignation, the hopeless resignation of the old, sometimes miscalled apathy. Sometimes they hardly exchanged a word, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to weariness. It was about a week after that the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and the sound of subdued weeping came from the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. "You will be cold." "It is colder for my son," said the old woman, and wept afresh. The sound of her sobs died away on his ears. The bed was warm, and his eyes heavy with sleep. He dozed fitfully, and then slept until a sudden wild cry from his wife awoke him with a start. "The paw," she cried wildly, "the monkey's paw." He started up in alarm. Where? Where is it? What's the matter?" She came stumbling across the room toward him. "I want it," she said quietly. "You've not destroyed it." "It's in the parlor on the bracket," he replied, marveling. "Why?" She cried and laughed together, and bending over, kissed his cheek. "I only just thought of it," she said hysterically. "Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" he questioned. "The other 2 wishes," she replied rapidly. "We've only had one." "Was that not enough?" he demanded fiercely. "No," she cried triumphantly. "We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly, and wish our boy alive again." The man sat up in bed and flung the bedclothes from his quaking limbs. "Good God, you are mad," he cried aghast. "Get it," she panted. "Get it quickly and wish, oh, my boy, my boy." Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Get back to bed," he said unsteadily. "You don't know what you're saying." "We had the first wish granted," said the old woman feverishly. "Why not the second?" "A coincidence," stammered the old man. "Go and get it and wish," cried his wife, quivering with excitement. The old man turned and regarded her, and his voice shook. "He has been dead 10 days, and besides, I would not tell you else, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now?" "Bring him back," cried the old woman, and dragged him toward the door. "Do you think I fear the child I have nursed?" So this wild-eyed grief, right, that longs for this child back at any cost, completely understandable and yet completely misguided, because we've now seen that the monkey's paw brings your wish to pass in the most terrible possible way, right? You wish for £200 to pay off your house. You get it because your son dies and the corporation gives you a pittance as a payout, right? Now we know that the son has been caught in some sort of machinery. He's a hideous, mangled wreck of himself, right? And the wife still wants him back. He went down in the darkness, the father did, and felt his way to the parlor and then to the mantelpiece. The talisman was in its place, and a horrible fear that the unspoken wish might bring his mutilated son before him ere he could escape from the room seized upon him, and he caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His brow cold with sweat, he felt his way round the table and groped along the wall until he found himself in the small passage with the unwholesome thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look upon it. He was afraid of her. "Wish," she cried in a strong voice. "It is foolish and wicked," he faltered. "Wish," repeated his wife. He raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The talisman fell to the floor, and he regarded it fearfully. Then he sank trembling into a chair as the old woman with burning eyes walked to the window and raised the blind. He sat until he was chilled with the cold, glancing occasionally at the figure of the old woman peering through the window. The candle end, which had burned below the rim of the china candlestick, was throwing pulsating shadows on the ceiling and walls until, with a flicker larger than the rest, it expired. The old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, crept back to his bed, and a minute or two afterward the old woman came silently and apathetically before him. So we think it didn't work, and then neither spoke, but lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. A stair creaked, and a squeaky mouse scurried noisily through the wall. The darkness was oppressive, and after lying for some time, screwing up his courage, he took the box of matches, and striking one, went downstairs for a candle. At the foot of the stairs, the match went out, and he paused to strike another. At the same moment, a knock, so quiet and stealthy as to be scarcely audible, sounded on the front door. The matches fell from his hand and spilled in the passage. He stood motionless, his breath suspended until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and fled swiftly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded throughout the house. "What's that?" cried the old woman, starting up. "A rat," said the old man in shaking tones. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in bed listening. A loud knock resounded through the house. "It's Herbert!" she screamed. "It's Herbert!" She ran to the door, but her husband was before her and, catching her by the arm, held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he whispered hoarsely. "It's my boy! It's Herbert!" she cried, struggling mechanically. "I forgot it was 2 miles away. That is the cemetery." So he's literally lifted up his mangled body out of the grave, and here he is. "What are you holding me for? Let go! I must open the door. For God's sake, don't let it in," cried the old man, trembling. "You're afraid of your own son," she cried, struggling. "Let me go. I'm coming, Herbert. I'm coming." There was another knock and another. The old woman, with a sudden wrench, broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the landing and called after her appealingly as she hurried downstairs. He heard the chain rattle back and the bottom bolt drawn slowly and stiffly from the socket. Then the old woman's voice, strained and panting. "The bolt," she cried loudly. "Come down. I can't reach it." But her husband was on his hands and knees, groping wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If he could only find it before the thing outside got in. A perfect fusillade of knocks reverberated throughout the house, and he heard the scraping of a chair as his wife put it down in the passage against the door. He heard the creaking of the bolt as it came slowly back, and at the same moment he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking ceased suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair drawn back, and the door opened. A cold wind rushed up the staircase, and a long, loud wail of disappointment and misery from his wife gave him courage to run down to her side and then to the gate beyond. The street lamp flickering opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road. And that's the end. This story terrifies me every time, right? Because of the fact that it's not told exactly what's happened to the son, right? What his body looks like, invites you to imagine the absolute worst, right? The things that you can imagine for yourself in your head are so much more frightening than the things that you see on screen in this really literal way or whatever, all the gore they shove in your face, right? Ultimately, that's just a kind of parlor trick, right? It's just kind of gross out humor. But this story is so brilliant because not only do we not know exactly what's happened to the son, but he doesn't ever even get in, right? And so they're left in this terrible but spooky bereavement, right? Of this corpse son body that has been knocking at their door ominously until finally he erases it from the world. And, this is why so many modern horror stories fail to me. Because why is W.W. Jacobs, who is not like the greatest genius in the world, why is he able to write this story that is so rich with implications about the Industrial Revolution, about the relationships between fathers and sons, about the implications of fate, right? And why is he able to do it in a way that still chills the blood, right? It's because what is the fate that we all can't escape? It's death, right? And Jacobs is tapping into this primal sense we have that thing, which is death, is not natural to us. It's not supposed to happen. It erases something from the world that ought to be there, right? That's why it's important that it's a young person who dies, that this is something that we deeply feel should not have occurred, right? And instead, we kind of fight against it with all of our might, but it creates these horrors, right? It creates this intuition that there's something gross and evil outside the door. It has to be personal, right? It has to be linked to our felt sense that there is such a thing as a soul. And now I am not talking about the actual ghost in the machine here, right? This idea that your soul is just a kind of floaty substance that floats around. I mean, that wasn't even a going view in antiquity. There were some people like Epicurus who thought something similar about the soul, but they didn't believe in an afterlife, right? Most smart people have believed that the soul is not something physical, right? And so when we tell ghost stories, we physicalize what we know about ourselves, which is that we have life in us and that life is an actual thing. Consciousness is a thing, right? It is the first actuality of a body having life potentially, as Aristotle says. And that is to say that the fact that we are self-aware, like we talked about a couple of weeks ago, the fact that we have qualitative experiences suggests to us that there's something in us that is more than just atoms bouncing off of one another. And the fear of that is the fear that that thing will be lost or corrupted or twisted in some way. And that's what ghost stories are essentially all about, right? That you toy with death, you toy with fate, and you end up in horror. Now I want to talk about a TV show briefly on Netflix called Midnight Mass. It's a mini series. I'm going to kind of spoil it, but not really. I'm going to give one little mention of something that happens at the end, but it won't spoil the actual outcome of the story. The basic premise of the story is you've got this tiny island. Most of the people on it are Catholics. A charismatic priest comes to the island at this round about the same time as this kind of disgraced black sheep son comes also back home to the island after having kind of gone off, achieved success in the world, but become an alcoholic and killed somebody in a drunk driving accident. So he's been in prison, he's tortured, he's lost his faith, he comes back home. He also is greeted there by this priest who seems like the best priest in the world, right? He's so sophisticated and smart and thoughtful and empathetic. And he performs miracles, like actual physical miracles. But of course, we realize that what's actually going on is he's having the miracles given to him by this hideous, dark creature, a demon or a vampire, right? This awful being that we see that he's met in the sands on the road to Damascus. So that's the premise, that's the story, and then it unfolds in all of these interesting ways, these sort of character relationships. A lot of the people in the show have legitimate Christian faith. The show is not anti-Christian at all, although its creator is an atheist. It's just that it doesn't have the resources to bring the thing home. And the show is fantastic. It's so creepy, so well done, up until the very end. At the climactic moment, one of the main characters, who's one of the characters who believes most in an afterlife, gives this like pantheistic speech about how we're all the cosmos. We're all just the cosmos dreaming of itself. And that's kind of the like last word that this show has on spirituality, right? Of course, if that's true, right, then what the heck was the demon, right? This is a show that depends utterly on the personal Christian vision of the soul, right? That you have a personhood, which is threatened by other personhoods, right? Which has a danger of going wrong and being corrupted. And all horror stories that are good, that succeed, that aren't just, physical gore fests, right, depend on this idea that you are something which is more than physical. Here's another article, again from Slate, which I really endorse. It's called "Midnight Mass is Drenched in Blood and Catholicism, but there's one thing missing." It's by a Catholic priest. He writes, Flanagan, that's the creator, Mike Flanagan, ultimately subverts Erin's half of the exchange by revisiting it and giving her a mystical, pantheistic monologue at the point of her own sacrificial death. There is no self, and we are all God, which is to say, the cosmos dreaming of itself. In which case, unless this too is an unreal dying experience, the vampire is also God. Does the cosmos prefer the Erin dream to the vampire dream? For me, this climactic monologue is the series' biggest misstep. Absolutely right? This idea that we're all kind of emanations of the cosmos, and the cosmos is this, cloud of atoms, right? Destroys the possibility of horror stories, because horror stories are one of the kind of dark sides of our intuition that we are souls. We have personal spirits that will endure after our death. That is why so many horror stories now are bad, and why you should return to people like W.W. Jacobs. If you want to read more creepy ghost stories, I would recommend looking up M.R. James, who is a phenomenal short story writer. I'm sure as the Halloween special rolls around, we will revisit James as well. But I hope the monkey's paw doesn't keep you up too much at night. I love these kind of creepy stories. We read basically the entire thing. I cut out a short passage for time halfway through, but really a very short one. And so that's basically the whole story of The Monkey's Paw. Okay, let's take a mailbag question. As you know, I take mailbag questions strictly from Young Heretics VIPs. And if you would like to become one, this is a great time, because we're offering a risk-free 1-month trial when you go to youngheretics.com/locals and use the offer code HERETICS in signing up for a 1-year annual membership. Now, if you don't like it, you can back out at the end of that month and nobody will judge you. But I think you will like it, honestly. I mean, the VIPs are a real gift to me, and I hope that they get a lot out of it too. I think they do. We get to talk every Friday about life, the universe, and everything, do live streams, exclusive articles that I write just for locals members, locals, VIPs, and we would love for you to join us. It's youngheretics.com/locals. Use the offer code HERETICS when you sign up for an annual membership, and you'll get 1 month risk-free as a trial. Hope to see you there. This is from Suijin, who's one of our most active VIPs, I think. He writes, as people living in the modern world, what are some of the best ways we can immerse ourselves in the mindset of what it really means to be a person in another time and how they thought about things? As a random example, our default conceptions of the world now are very different from during, say, the time of Aquinas or Aristotle. What are some good ways to better understand how their experiences and conception of various topics differed from our own? So this is a really profound question, I think, because we have this idea, right, that logic is logic and thoughts are thoughts. And so we can just, encounter anybody easily from the past. And that's kind of true. It's true in the sense that there is a great brotherhood of man and there must be some common things about all human experience. Otherwise, it would be impossible to talk to one another. But just like people from other countries speak different languages, right? People from other times have different assumptions, different conditions around them. There are all sorts of things that we might not think about, right? Or know about, like the fact that Aristotle, has all these different words for love, or Plato has all these different words for love, right? We talk about this in Greek all the time, that there are at least 6 Greek words that could reasonably be translated as love in various contexts. And that shapes what he thinks, right? He might not even think about all those things as the same thing in the way that we do. Aristotle famously has a long discussion of different ways that the word good, right, can be used. And that's specific to the Greek language. So there's all sorts of stuff, right? Cultural conditions of the world that might affect how people are talking. The reason I brought this question up this time on this episode is because I think a major key to grasping what it's like to be in a certain period is literature and fiction, right? Fiction specifically, not just any kind of literature, but stories that people tell. And you can kind of see what I mean by that when you look at something like The Monkey's Paw, right? And you say, this is a way of conveying what the world is like in a certain pocket of the world at a certain time for certain people, right? For these lower class English people living in the Southeast, right? Probably, although it's not specified, but that's where Jacobs comes from, right? Living in a rural community, sending their son off to work in the factory or in the factory farm or whatever. This is what that life looks like. And the reason why that is often fictional is because you have to invent certain things that maybe didn't happen exactly. Aristotle talks about this in terms of plausibility, right? Not what did happen, but what would have happened, the characteristic events and the characteristic ways that people respond. That first paragraph where the whites are playing, the father and son are playing chess, and the wife is knitting in the corner. That's this little condensed vignette that tells you so much more than you could ever get from like a little, from a 5,000 word essay on social conditions in England at the turn of the 20th century, right? Because it's a heartfelt depiction. It's a depiction that somebody experienced and then put into an essay and then conveyed to you. One of the other VIPs was talking about Tolstoy's theory of art, which is basically about this, right? About having an experience, conveying that experience, putting it into another person through external means. And that's one of the best ways to get a grasp of the, thought world, even of authors who write nonfiction. So Aristotle, you mentioned, and Aquinas, right? If you want to understand Aristotle's world, read some Greek tragedy, right? He obviously studied Greek tragedy, and it was one of the governing art forms. Read some Greek poetry, right? These literary forms that are designed to convey the qualitative experience of being in a time and place can help situate you when you then go and see, right? Well, what was Plato talking about when he exiled the poets? What were the poets like, right? What happened around his time, right? That people did with regards to poetry, who acted in these plays, all of this stuff. You can then relate back to understanding the worldview of people who are writing more sort of dry philosophical prose. One of the great truths, I think, of reading is that literary culture and fictional culture doesn't just exist for its own sake, but also to preserve the color of the world, like Herodotus sort of talks about in his Prelude, right? Read fiction. Don't discount it. Don't think of it as a minor entertainment. Think of it as part of the way you fill in your picture of a period when you come to somebody like Aristotle or Aquinas. All right. That's it from me. See you on Locals, youngheretics.com/locals. If you like this show, you will love the Claremont Institute. It is the think tank where I work. We are a society for the recovery and defense of the American idea. There has never been a better time to be defending and advancing the American idea. We do this through 2 publications mainly. One is a magazine, the Claremont Review of Books, and one is online, the American Mind claremont.org. If you'd like to donate and support our work, I would really appreciate that. It's claremont.org/donate. When you do, let them know in the notes that we sent you from Young Heretics. All right, folks, that's it from me. I will see you next week for more truth, beauty, and the stuff